Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome, on behalf of our chairman, Randy Teague, and our president, Roger Ream, welcome to the Fund for American Studies' first all-institute lecture of the summer. Winston Churchill once said, "Everyone is in favor of free speech. Hardly a day passes without it being extolled. But some people's idea of it is that they are free to say what they like, but if anybody says anything else back, that's an outrage." Benjamin Franklin said, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech." Today, the debate over free speech is raging. Ground zero for much of that debate is on the colleges and universities that you guys attend. But, as most of you know, it's not restricted to campuses. Places like Portland and elsewhere are debating this for a very good reason. So tonight, we want to explore this issue in depth with you. Some of the questions that we'll be looking at are, is there ever a time when the free speech can or should be curtailed? How does the right to protest or dissent fit into the debate? What about quote-unquote hate speech? Is there an underlying philosophical divide that makes this issue impossible to resolve? Are we even at the point that we're afraid or even incapable of debating each other? The title of tonight's lecture is, "When Debate Dies, Who Loses?" Indeed. Some of you might not think there's even a problem. Others see this as the defining issue of the day, one that Franklin warned threatens the liberty of the nation. Tonight we have two great speakers to help facilitate our conversation. Hopefully you all have read their bios, so I won't read them to you. But let's welcome Dr. Walter Kimbrough, president of Dillard University out of New Orleans, and Greg Lukianoff, the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Let's give them a warm applause.
Good evening. All right, I'm from the South. So usually when you start talking to people, you like them to talk back a little bit. I'm a preacher's kid, too. So good evening. Good evening. Thank you. I know y'all had a long day and you're tired, so if I get you to talk a little bit, that'll help. I want to thank everyone for this invitation and the chance to share some things with you. I'm going to tell a story and then ask some questions that you can reflect upon. And I'll give some context to those questions. I want to tell you the story of a man by the name of Harold Moore Jr. Harold Moore Jr. was a native of Houston, Texas. When he finished high school, he matriculated to Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I currently serve as president. He was a very active student, but he also served as a United Methodist minister as a student. Active on campus, joined a fraternity in 1967. In 1970, before he left Dillard and eventually graduated from Pepperdine University, he joined the Nation of Islam. He became one of the disciples of Minister Louis Farrakhan. His name then changed. Mr. Farrakhan gave him the name Khalid. And by the mid-1980s, he was now known as Khalid Muhammad. Khalid Muhammad was a dynamic speaker, but said a lot of incendiary things and caused a lot of chaos wherever he went. Some of his offensive remarks were really geared toward whites, Jews, and gays. He was most famous for a speech he gave at Keene College at the time, which is now Keene University in New Jersey, where he called Jews bloodsuckers and honkies. And he called the Pope a no-good cracker. If you are familiar with the hip-hop group Public Enemy, there is a song called Night of the Living Bassheads from the album It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, 1988. And in the beginning of that, and you can listen to it later, you will hear a voice that is Khalid Muhammad. Have you forgotten that we were brought here? We were robbed of our names, robbed of our language. We lost our religion, our culture, and our God. And many of us, by the way we act, we even lost our minds. This was Khalid Muhammad. Well, why am I telling you this story of a man who generated a lot of concern? Pressure, even within the African-American community, was on Minister Farrakhan to censure him after those remarks at King. And when he eventually died of a heart attack, Dwayne Wickham, an African-American writer for USA Today, in an op-ed entitled Death of Black Bigot Ends Life of Hatred, he called him the alter ego of the Grand Dragon, the flip side of Bull Connor. This story is important because I began my higher ed career as coordinator of Greek life at Emory University in Atlanta, where I'm from. In 1993, the Black Student Alliance for Black History Month in January or February 1994 invited one Khalid Muhammad. There was a lot of pressure. Anybody here from Emory? Georgia, okay, I got my PhD from Georgia State. We count that. Okay. Georgia State count. Okay, so I got the Atlanta people here too. Okay. So there was a lot of concern. Emory has a very diverse population, including a large Jewish population. There was lots of calls and pressure on the president of the institution to cancel Khalid Muhammad's appearance. Black Student Alliance was, no, we want this to happen. We paid for it. The university stepped in, canceled his appearance. Created a lot of tension on campus. Black students marched on campus. That April, we had a Black Student Summit where all of the high, upper-level administrators, me as one of the few African-American administrators, spent a day talking with Black students to figure out how we would move forward as Emory University. So that sort of sets my perspective as to where it is now, because I felt like it was wrong for Emory to cancel that appearance. And as a college president who really believes in bringing a diversity of ideas to campus, I've done that I'm in my 13th year as a college president. And I've been the president of 2 historically Black institutions. So as a part of my lecture series, the one at Philander Smith was called Bless the Mic, because I am the hip hop president. I will always be the hip hop president. And at Dillard University, we call it brain food. So within that time, I've had very conservative speakers like Ann Coulter, Ward Connerly, Charles Murray, Jason Riley, Rich Lowry, and Mary Madeline. And I've had your left speakers, Michael Eric Dyson, Al Sharpton, Tim Wise, Father Michael Flager, Roland Martin, and James Carville, all as a part of that campus experience. But as I wrote in an article, which is the title of this lecture tonight, I don't know if we can do that as much today because there's a lot of pushback when we have those kinds of speakers. And so here are the 4 questions I want to ask you and get you to think about. Question number 1, who decides which speech is permissible? Who makes that decision? Very recently on our campus, and the precursor for all of the things that have happened on college campuses this year, because when you read a lot of these articles and they talk about, the things that happened at Texas A&M and at Middlebury and at Cal Berkeley, where my mom went to school, Dillard never really makes the list because we were sort of the precursor of everything that happened. Because you see, in November, we were the site of a debate for candidates running to be senator for the state of Louisiana. And one of the people who made the debate that was hosted by Raycom, we just rented out our space like George Mason rented out this space tonight. We rented out a space. And as a part of that process, one of the people who some kind of way made the debate was former Grand Dragon of the KKK, David Duke. So, of course, the headline writes itself. Former Klan leader speaks at historically Black college. That's a big national story. I was in Washington, D.C. Rachel Maddow was talking about it. My phone started blowing up. Dude, y'all got who coming to your? I'm like, I didn't invite David Duke. That's not. But it was a lot. There was a lot of concern on the campus, and one of our students, Mariah Hickman, who was here, was you were secretary of SGA this past year. So she got to see it up close and personal. And when we had outside people come in and people were upset, and I was trying to get back to campus because I had to pick up my kids and wait for the babysitter. And Mariah sent me an email. She was like, I wouldn't even come up here. These people don't even know what they're debating about. So it was a lot of concern about that, but people said that it wasn't permissible for a man with those views to even participate in the debate. And I'm like, well, who decides that? The state of Louisiana decided that he was eligible to run for Senate. The state of Louisiana also decided that he was eligible to serve in the U.S. Congress representing the state of Louisiana. The state also allowed him to run for governor when he got over 35% of the vote. So now he can't participate in the debate. As I told people earlier this week, it's a damn debate. People are supposed to argue with each other. So why do you want to not have that perspective as a part of it? So question number one is, who decides which speech is unsuitable? Who decides which speech is permissible? Question number two, do we obsess over speech but ignore acts? The most controversial speaker that I brought to Dillard was Corinne Stephans. Anybody know who Corinne Stephans is? Raise your hand if you know who Corinne Stephans is. I see just a few. Corinne Stephans wrote a tell-all book in 2005 about being a video vixen. And so she talked about being on the set of the videos, dancing in the videos, and all the stars that she slept with. So it had shockwaves through the hip-hop community because she was naming names. And that's the first time that had happened, that she took some kind of agency to say, oh, I'm about to tell everything. And it wasn't like she glorified herself. She, in all of her books, she talked about, I got some issues with myself, and so I allowed myself to be passed around from man to man as a part of this experience. And there were people who were really upset about it. And I had some alums saying, how could you have a person like that speaking on our campus? And I was reminding them that in July of 2006, right after Hurricane Katrina, at our first commencement back on campus, the commencement speaker was one William Cosby. After allegations started leaking out about the stuff that Cosby had been doing, for which he is on trial right now. So we're more upset about the woman who wrote a book saying what she did voluntarily than the man who now has been charged with sexual offenses of dozens of women. Or as I tell people like this, we had a petition that about 200 people signed saying, don't have Corinne Stephans speak on our campus. To this date, I've only had one alumnus say we should rescind the honorary degree we gave Cosby in 2006. So why are we more concerned about certain things being said versus what people actually do? I mean, most recently, I don't know if you've been following the flap with Bill Maher. I watch Bill Maher a lot. And so when I was watching him last Friday and he slipped into the N-word, I was like, oh, you about to get it. People about to lose their mind. And so for the last few days, people were just like, his show should be canceled because he used the word, and not at someone, he used it referencing himself. And I'm like, so we cancel Bill Maher's show, but nobody still wants to talk about Chris Brown beating Rihanna. We're dealing with politics of respectability and different actions for different people. Or we aren't talking about R. Kelly and all the stuff that R. Kelly did. R. Kelly's about to come to New Orleans. There's going to be people all up in that place when he comes. And R. Kelly is foul. R. Kelly is foul, but we're more upset about Bill Maher using the N-word in 5 seconds than all the stuff that R. Kelly has done. So that's the second question. Why are we sometimes obsessing over speech versus acts, and we ignore those acts? Number three, Is there a value to hearing the other side? I met a student who says she's interested in being an attorney. I'm sure there are a number of you. How many of you are interested in becoming an attorney? Okay, there are a lot of you. I'm married to an attorney, okay, who has been texting me. I really want to text her back. I wait because she went to Starbucks to see if I could get something when I came home. Like, y'all stop and get a brother something to eat when I come. So I need to have some dessert when I get back. My side job is I'm an expert witness in hazing cases. I've done more expert witness work than anybody in the country, and there's all kinds of groups, not just historically black groups. Most of the expert witness cases I've done have been for NiC Groups. As a part of the process, when I'm working on a case, I'm given my files, I study everything that happens. After we get into it a little deeper, there is a time when I am going to be deposed. When I am being deposed, the party that is being sued has their attorney come meet with me. It usually takes about a day or so. And they ask me all kinds of questions to try to figure out if we go to trial and they put me on the stand, what position am I going to take? Because none of you ever wants to deal with an attorney who will go into a court for you and they don't know what the other people are going to say. They would never do that. That's malpractice, not to even know. So that's the part of the process. You have to understand the other side. You have to understand the differences. So when it comes to speech on campus, why is it that we don't value hearing the other side, particularly of those of you who want to be attorneys, because your job will be to listen to the other side. You cannot do your job if you don't do it. So why not practice it now? And finally, do we infantilize the college experience arguing that some voices should not be allowed on campus? A friend of mine, Andre Perry, who is an educator, wrote an op-ed recently, says, I finally agree, college isn't for everyone. And this is part of what he says. He says the temptation of the argument that even hate speech should be allowed in a place of learning in the name of unfettered thought is wrong-headed, because white nationalism is based on a brutal and artificial hierarchy. He wrote this in response to the recent murder of Bowie State University student Richard Collins III by a student at the University of Maryland who I believe is a self-identified white supremacist. Andre goes on to write, his murder by the hands of a white supremacist proves that there are some organizations and people who should not be welcomed to the hallowed halls of higher education. Once again, if I put on my hat as an expert witness, in the last 30 years, I could argue that college fraternities and sororities have killed more people than white supremacists on college campuses. So does that apply to them as well? That there is not a place for those groups in the hallowed halls because they could kill someone? Because that happens annually. We just had a big case at Penn State where 18 people have been arrested for hazing. We haven't had a big case where 18 white supremacists have killed someone. So if that's the standard that we're using, are we going to apply it equally? So as I close, there's two editorials a day that I'll mention. The first in the Chronicle of Higher Education, called The New Censorship on Campus. The authors write, it is an illusion for minority groups to believe that they can censor the speech of others today without having their own expression muzzled tomorrow. This was prophetic, that statement, and it came out this morning. They said part of the reason you shouldn't do that is that you martyr your opponents. They get larger audiences, more book sales. The only reason David Duke was even in the debate in Louisiana, he knew he was never going to be the senator. He was trying to generate because he's got competition now. You got Richard Spencer out there and people like that. David Duke is like, I'm trying to get back on the scene. I'm trying to ride the wave. How can I be relevant again? So it was all about free publicity for him. And when people went to protest, he was loving it. His name was in the papers for weeks because of that. So that wasn't what he tried to do. So they also argued in this piece that it might be a sign of intellectual weakness and a lack of confidence that we can't compete with those ideas. We've got to understand that you all and all of us live in a world where most 18 to 24-year-olds do not go to college. They are not in college. Only 40% are. So just to say, let's deal with this in this college experience, you are still in the minority. Why this concerns me in their statement talking about how it would have an expression being muzzled tomorrow, just this afternoon, the legislature in Louisiana has now passed a new bill to protect campus speakers. And so what it says, part of the article, is a bill aimed at preventing the disruption of campus speakers won final legislative approval Tuesday. The measure, House Bill 269, stems from controversy at the University of California at Berkeley and elsewhere, especially episodes where conservative speakers were shouted down. The House voted 95-0 to go along with the Senate changes to the original bill. So now you have states making rules about how people will behave and what the consequences are. So now we got folks you don't want involved in this, involved in it, because sometimes we don't control ourselves. So one of the things that we might lose because of that kind of action when debate dies is the ability to think and act freely. So, backstory, the 4 questions, and we'll have a chance to engage in other questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. That was a fantastic speech, and I agree with pretty much all of it. So I'm sure there'll be some debate to be had during the questions, but I'm actually here to do something that lawyers usually don't do. I'm here to de-problematize something. And what do I mean by that? Hold on. Well, first, I'd like to offer my excuse. If I seem a little tired or sleepy and in a hurry to get home, that's what I'm getting home to. But first, I want to talk about the law. So I'm a First Amendment lawyer. I went to law school to study First Amendment law, and when I ran out of classes in First Amendment law, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty in my spare time. This has always been my passion. I work for the ACLU of Northern California. This is what I want to do my whole life, and I've been working on campuses for years. Nonetheless, despite all that background, I was absolutely blown away back in 2001 at how easy it was to get in trouble for what you say on the modern college campus. And this is, back what people might see today as a golden age of free speech on campus. Now, what you might not know is there have been over 60 lawsuits since the heyday of quote-unquote, this isn't a term I love, but it's useful, of politically correct speech codes, going back to the 1980s and 1990s. The first attempt to address hateful or sexist speech, going back in the 80s and 90s. And there have been nearly 60, actually there have been over 60 lawsuits. Virtually every single one of those have ended in the code being overturned or the code being abandoned because that you can't square them with the First Amendment. And what do I mean by speech codes? I mean codes like this. This is a policy actually at University of West Alabama. Today, it just blanketly bans harsh text messages or emails. Every single one of you is guilty of violating this at some point in your life. Don't kid yourself. And the next one is actually has a wonderful history: inappropriately directed laughter. That was a policy that actually has a long history. It was passed by University of Connecticut in 1990, shot down by a court and laughed at, perhaps inappropriately, in the court of public opinion, be careful, in 1991, and amazingly came back from the dead at Drexel University in Philadelphia 15 years later. The only way you could have found this policy was by looking up on Google what is the most ludicrously unconstitutional code that a school has ever tried to get away with. And they just cut and pasted into their policy. So despite all of these lawsuits, we're still at a point when about 40% of universities that we rate maintain what we would call red light speech codes. I'll spare you the legalese. Red light means laughably unconstitutional. 40%, originally when we first started doing it, it was about 75% of schools had laughably unconstitutional policies. So we're making some progress, but not nearly enough. So we started a litigation program. Now, really quickly, private colleges are not bound by the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech. A private college can decide not to honor freedom of speech if it wants to. However, most colleges do, whether they're private or not, do promise free speech in glowing language. Private colleges that promise free speech, in our opinion, should be held to it. But public colleges absolutely do have to live up to their promises of freedom of speech as a matter of law. And these are the kind of cases that I deal with. This is the first lawsuit we had. This is a student who was trying to hand out copies of the United States Constitution on the public areas of a public campus in California on Constitution Day. He was approached by a campus police officer and told he wasn't allowed to be handing out material without getting permission from the state. The shocked student is there trying to explain. It's like, I'm actually literally holding the First Amendment in my hands. And what's going on in this scene is he's being told by an administrator that he has to apply to use the tiny free speech zone on campus, and sadly, it's not available in September, so no Constitution Day for you. How about October? They actually offered him October. I thought that was amazing. But he got to, we had a lawsuit. He was able to, he sued, and he was able to pass out constitutions, and the sky did not fall. This is another free speech zone that we dealt with at University of Hawaii. This is a case, now, and what I'm trying to establish here is, if I were to pretend that what I do on a daily basis is deal with really harsh cases, I would be lying to you. This is how bad it actually is. Some of the stuff you'll hear on TV, they really do focus on the sexier, maybe more difficult, maybe more polarizing cases. But most of what I've been dealing with for my entire career are cases that look a lot more like this. This is University of Hawaii. Students were told that they both couldn't hand out copies of the Constitution at one time, or that they couldn't protest the NSA outside of this tiny little free speech swamp for which they needed advanced permission to use. When asked what's going on here, don't we have First Amendment rights, they were told, quote unquote, it's not the 60s anymore. That's a very good fact if you're a lawyer, by the way, to go into court with that. To University of Hawaii Hilo's credit, they actually, as soon as we litigated in this case, they fixed the policy right away. We actually really enjoyed working with them. This one probably takes the cake. This is a student, and I mean, these codes are used against students across the political spectrum. And this is an animal rights activist who was not only told that he had to limit his free speech activities to the tiny free speech area on campus, that he needed 2 weeks advance permission to use, he had to wear a little tag saying that he had been granted free speech rights by the university. Not by the First Amendment, apparently. This one ended up having to settle for a little bit more than usual, given how outrageous it was. And this I just wanted to show because it's the saddest little free speech zone I've seen in my life. The free speech zone in this case at Blinn College is not the pathetic little board right there. It's those two little blocks on either side of it. That was the only place at Blinn University where you were allowed to engage in quote-unquote free speech activities. So as you can see, a lot of these cases are not all that hard. So this is a graph showing our record of wins and losses when it comes to speech codes litigation over the years. Now, I did explain the distinction between public versus private. So I'm going to get to some of the more culture war stuff, kind of like what you might describe as the sexy stuff, the stuff that's going to get on MSNBC or on Fox News. And a lot of that lately revolves around things like microaggressions, for example. Now, I've written articles that people have interpreted as me being hostile to the concept of microaggressions. How many people here know what microaggressions are? I should have asked. I assumed you all did, so good. And I always have to say this as a caveat. I think that microaggressions are incredibly interesting things to study. I think they're absolutely worthy topics of scholarly debate. My mother is British, my father is Russian. They're always offending each other all the time. I think cross-cultural microaggressions are wonderful things to study. But the problem is that when they get in the hands of administrators, they start looking an awful lot like a short list of things administrators wish you wouldn't say. I'm showing this opinion because this is if you've never read any legal opinion, read this one, because it talks about how it's not the government's role to establish what shall be orthodox in politics or speech. Now, this is what is currently the policy at UCLA. They define microaggressions as including statements like, I believe the most qualified person should get the job, including America is a land of opportunity, America is a melting pot, and more controversially, affirmative action is racist. Now, saying that these are tiny forms of violence against the oppressed, to say the least, creates an atmosphere where professors are going to be thinking twice before they actually decide to take any of these positions or even engage in devil's advocacy. And believe me, if you're in a law school, you have to be able to figure out how to make arguments both for and against virtually any position under the sun. This is a policy that University of New Hampshire had, sort of a quasi-microaggression policy. Fox News got a hold of this one, and it made sort of short work of it. But guess what they're objecting to? The use of the word American to be a microaggression, problematic language. Now, I wasn't that offended by that. I grew up with plenty of friends from Central and South America. I was corrected a lot saying, well, we're all Americans, you're from the U.S. The one that I found the most offensive on this list is actually Arab. I used to work in a Lebanese restaurant where the boss was very proud of being an Arab. And the idea that some university administrator would try to say that his proud self-description was actually offensive only reminded me of an episode of The Office in which Michael Scott tried to run his own diversity day. And he asked Oscar, his beloved employee, how do you self-describe? And Oscar very proudly says, well, I'm Mexican. And Michael goes, ooh, is there a less offensive way to refer to you? Which is, of course, the most offensive thing you could possibly say. And they're actually trying to tell students that what they should call each other, call people from who are Arab, they should self-refer to themselves as Southwestern Asian? They gave them an entirely new title to call themselves that nobody was going to do. So probably the least appreciated situation on campus is the role of the federal government in making some of these things worse. These are two real cases that involve a overbroad definition of harassment. This is a professor who wrote about her thoughts that the current definition of Title IX harassment was infantilizing, that it went too far, and guess what? She was brought up for investigation for writing an article about criticizing Title IX under Title IX. She was investigated by essentially a secret court for 72 days. She was not allowed to know who was investigating her. Now, this is something that the government does not have power to do, just to be clear. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand that this is not something they can require Northwestern University to do, yet they did it nonetheless. And they only backed down finally when she brought her behind-the-scenes ordeal once again to the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education today. But the idea that someone could have it in their head that even criticizing the overreach from a law was itself a violation of the law shows that we've gone very far away from First Amendment standards. This is a case where we're working on right now where a professor was fired for using a swear word in the course of a case where she was describing a real interaction with parents of students she'd worked with that involved one salty word, and she was fired with the university citing the Department of Education's incredibly overbroad definition of harassment. We're pretty confident that if we get this in front of any judge to look at it on its merits, what's called the blueprint definition will be laughed out of court. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the real-world implications of this. Now, this is a poster for a movie I'm the executive producer of. It's called Can We Take a Joke? It's taking a little bit of a different way to approach the issues on campus. And we take the perspective that if the beloved comedian of the 1960s, Lenny Bruce, were alive today, he would not last 5 minutes on the modern campus. That guy was offensive and on purpose, and it was hilarious. So, I'm just going to end with a couple stats. Now, this survey, I have to admit, kind of shocked me. This was a survey of about 35% of the total population of Yale University. I've been looking at surveys like this my whole career, and generally, if you ask people questions as easy and milquetoast as, hey, is it a nice environment for conservatives on your campus? You'd get most students saying, yeah, well, sure, it's a welcoming environment for conservatives, a welcoming environment for everyone. Well, that has changed. In this survey, again, of around 35% of the undergraduate population of Yale, they asked the entire student population, is it a welcoming environment for conservatives? 75% of the total population said no. When they asked conservatives, only 95% of the population said no. Those are like horrifying numbers, unlike I've seen in my entire career. And this is a much earlier study in which they asked students if it was safe to merely hold unpopular points of view on campus. This was a 2010 study, comparatively a golden age for free speech on college campuses. And nonetheless, what you see is that every year students are there, they become less confident that it's safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. Freshmen are the most optimistic, sophomores slightly less so, juniors slightly less so, seniors the least so. There are only 30% of them, strongly agreed. And guess who the single most pessimistic constituency about how safe it is to hold unpopular points of view on campus was? Professors, faculty. Only 16.7% of professors in 2010 strongly agree with the statement that it was safe to merely hold unpopular points of view on campus. If you were to take that, I would really love to see how people respond to that question today, given that we've turned a corner in this. Because for most of my time, it's been frustrating, I admit, to be fighting cases that are so obviously unconstitutional, so obviously going against the values of a university, 9 times out of 10. Like I said, most of our cases are not hard cases. But we did turn a corner that scares me a little bit. I write a lot about political polarization. I'm trying to figure out ways to remedy it. But when people, particularly on college campuses that are supposed to be places that really welcome, meaty exchanges of ideas, when they actually turn into battlegrounds, I get kind of scared. And sitting down and watching these videos from the Milo riots at Berkeley, it was much worse than I thought. Actually seeing a girl and her husband smashed across the face with a metal telephone pole, smashed over the head, big pool of blood. They could have been killed. Multiple people easily could have been killed during this. And I'm afraid that once you start down the path of conflating words with violence, we're getting away with one of the best tools for peace we've ever came up with, which is the idea that we decide to settle things through words, not rocks or actions. So I usually give a lot of homework at the end of my talks, but I just want to leave you guys tonight with one that would make the world just a lot better. Make it a lifelong habit to seek out smart people with whom you disagree. If we did more of that as a country, if we did more of that as a world, we could actually start making some positive changes. We could actually start cultivating some new ideas. But I'm sorry to say at the moment, I think our country is getting worse at this, not better. So I just wanted to leave you with my contact information. Real pleasure chatting with you, and I look forward to your questions.
So we're going to do audience Q&A, and both Dr. Kimbrough and Greg will be here. So we have 2 microphones. So if you would like to ask a question, raise your hand, and Joel or Pat will give you a microphone. So why don't we start here?
What do you guys think about recent incidents in Canada? I believe it was University of Ontario, where a professor was professionally reprimanded for not using a student's preferred pronouns, and more recently a college in Washington that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, where a professor was hounded out of a job for not participating in a quote-unquote diversity day, where he was asked to take the day off.
Oh, sure. The situation in Ontario is one that would be a very easy decision under American First Amendment law, because it's considered as bad as it is to tell people what they can't say, it's considered under First Amendment law, and the case that I was citing, Barnett, a much bigger violation to require people to say particular things. So if that incident were to happen in the U.S. at a public campus, I think it would be very easy from a legal standpoint. I can understand you can make arguments that it might be harder, but it's just coercing people to talk how you want them to talk is not generally the solution to most genuinely pluralistic societies. But the problem, of course, is that Canada doesn't have anything like the First Amendment, and I've seen a lot of horrifying cases come out of Canada, including really early on in my career. I saw someone saying that they were getting in trouble because their academic findings disagreed with the academic findings of the president of their Canadian university, and that they were being sent letters saying you shouldn't disagree with the academic findings of the president. I'm like, this sounds like North Korea. It was absolutely like a horrifying case, so I think Canada actually suffers by its weak free speech protections.
Let me talk a little bit about the Evergreen State case that you talked about, and I've been following that one. It's interesting. Just to give you the background, students of color there have had this day over a number of years where it's sort of like, what would the campus be like if we were not here? And so it's a day they sort of voluntarily don't show up and they aren't on that campus. Well, for this year, they wanted to flip it. They wanted to ask, and I can't remember what the percentage of students of color is at Evergreen State, but they wanted all of the white professors and students to voluntarily leave the campus for a day. And so there was a professor there who, part of his background, he wrote I think it's an op-ed in, I want to say it's New York Times or Wall Street Journal. I read a couple days ago. He was just like, no, I'm not leaving. You're not making me leave. And he's out of history, even as a student, for challenging. He challenged some actions of fraternities. They had some strippers when he was an undergrad, and he didn't like how that was. So this is part of his background. And so I agree with him. He shouldn't have to do that. I mean, part of it is, part of me is, my undergrad degree is from the University of Georgia. My master's is Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, where as a graduate student, Miami was 3% black. I could go the whole day and not see somebody else black. And I ran one of the residence halls too, okay? And so as a president of a historically black institution, there's a lot of that tension going on right now. Students have to go to colleges and find places that are a good fit for them and not go and try to make it something that it isn't. My wife went to Talladega. It's a small historically black college in Alabama. And she always says, how can you get mad when you go to France and people are speaking French? You knew what it was when you got there. So you knew what Evergreen State was when you got there. If you needed all this blackness around you, you should have come to Dillard, because I got blackness every day, starting with the president. That's just if that's what you need, but you go to that place. I went to Miami and accepted Miami for what it was. And it was a great, I love Miami. It was a great experience for me, even though I could go all day long and not see anybody else black. But so that's part of what's happening is that people say, well, I want to have all these accoutrements that I expect to have that fit in for me, when that's not what that place provides. So I think he did the right thing. But he said I haven't seen the video. I don't want to see it. That people sort of bum rushed his class and they went in there and threatened him because he spoke out and he sent out an email saying, I'm not leaving. I'm not doing this. I think he has the right to do that. But Greg talked about it. It's not even incivility. It's scary now because there are people who want to make that a battle. That man has a right not to do that. He's like, I'm trying to teach my class. I'm a biology person. I'm not dealing with all the political stuff. I just want to teach my class, and now you want me to be a part of this. I think that that's fair, but that just shows you in terms of the kind of tension that we're seeing on campus that is scary. Yeah. So that worries, as a president, that worries me.
Yeah. It's different than I've seen in my whole career, too. That's the pick.
My name is Mallory, and I'm a firm believer that this country, unfortunately, has becoming progressively more politically dogmatic. And for the past 2 years, I have been trying to find ways to build bridges with those who think differently than me. I believe that uncomfortable conversation is key. But how do we reach out to those people who are dogmatic and their minds are closed?
I'll start. I mean, I think colleges and universities, we have to model that behavior. So, as I said, from my campus, I want our students to hear a range of people. I mentioned Jason Riley, who is an editor for the Wall Street Journal. 7 years ago, he wrote a piece saying we shouldn't have HBCUs. So I invited him to an HBCU. Black guy. But I want him to, and it was a good exchange with him and the students. Same thing with Warwick Connolly, Mr. Anti-Affirmative Action. I had him at my last campus. But we had a really good conversation in terms of him saying, I might need to rethink some of my previous thoughts about HBCUs. So he was able to learn. Even when I hosted Ann Coulter, and people thought I was a new president. They thought I was crazy for doing it. She spoke. We went to dinner afterwards. We argued over dinner for 2 hours. Best time of my life. We had a good, we didn't agree on anything, and we argued. But if I send her an email today, she will respond to me. And like I said, we don't agree on anything. But it was that kind of just sort of understanding each other. If she says something crazy now, I'm just like, oh, that's just Ann. But we still had a good exchange. And so I think as institutions, we have to model some of that behavior. But part of the problem is now, and I'm a big social media person, so y'all make sure y'all follow me. We get all that out there later. Social media allows us to just get into these narrow silos. So if we look at who we follow, very few of us follow people who are diametrically opposed to us. We just get in our little bubbles. And so we had that same thing reinforced every day to us, every hour of every day. So it makes us even less open to hear something that's different. So one of the easiest things you can start doing is find somebody that's diametrically opposed to you and start following them on social media. And that's an easy, non-confrontational way just to sort of get some of that in and see how you process and go from there. That's a way to do it. But I mean, we're easily siloed off, and social media now has, made it worse, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a short book called Freedom from Speech in 2014, and my overall theory on this is that one of the side effects of some aspects of progress and affluence is that we can have wonderful media that allow us to cocoon ourselves in bubbles of agreement. But also, if you have better physical mobility and cities aren't decentralized, there was a scholar who saw this coming in the 1970s, and he saw this wonderful world where we all get to move to communities that reflect our values. I can move to San Francisco, or I can move to Texas, and we can all be with people who think like us, without really fully thinking through about what that would mean for people's tolerance for people they disagree with. And I think it's a factor of some very positive things that we are getting, and I believe we are. The evidence of what's called effective polarization. We actually don't disagree as much as sometimes you might think, but we hate each other for how little we disagree. So the first value you got to get is curiosity, and I think modeling good behavior is a great idea. But I also think that having people. That's why I end my speech is always with that one particular guidance, because first you got to get people to want to hear from people they disagree with, and right now we do tend to. There is a tendency to treat people you disagree with as more like blasphemers and heretics, and that parents can do a better job. K through 12 needs to do a much better job of that, and I think colleges should do a better job of it as well.
Hi. So my question is, what is both of your takes on along the lines of you can't say bomb on an airplane or you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater?
Oh boy. You have just mentioned the bane of every First Amendment lawyer's existence, the misquoted opinion from Oliver Wendell Holmes. Well, surely you can't shout fire in a crowded movie theater. And we always have to remind people, okay, first of all, that's from an opinion before Oliver Wendell Holmes was actually good on freedom of speech. Second of all, it's that you should not falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. It has absolutely no legal meaning, but it sounds so cool. People repeat it all the time. So when it comes to kind of like whether or not you can, so there's and it also there's a qualification when it's likely to cause a riot in which people are actually harmed. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern would actually do this every single night. One of the most popular plays for decades would actually do this right in the middle of the play. They go, fire! And they go, oh, there goes that idea. And they made a point out of that. So if you're asking about threats doctrine, there's nothing controversial about threats doctrine. If you basically put someone in a position where they believe that they are going to be blown up or physically harmed, that's a no-brainer. There's not a country in the world that doesn't allow you to prevent actual threats. Now, if you get to more tougher cases where someone's actually cracking a joke about a bomb, for example, that's something that I would, as a former ACLU lawyer, be willing to see someone in court about.
Expert, I can pass.
I'm Jacob Knutson from Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. If such a case were to happen on a private college, do students have any options whatsoever, or?
They do. It's just tougher. Well, it depends on if the private college, if you're lucky enough to go to a private college in California, there is actually a state law that gives free speech protections the same that are under the First Amendment to people who attend my alma mater, for example, Stanford. So that's one exception. But schools are generally held to their own promises of freedom of speech, and that has real contractual meaning in most states in the union. Not all, but most states in the union. So you can potentially sue. That being said, since most universities pride themselves on being citadels of freedom of speech, if you are at a private school and you get trouble for your opinion, contact FIRE. We have a long history of fighting and winning against private schools that promise free speech but then don't deliver.
Yeah, all you have to do is just check your handbook. because the private institutions will have some statement that really provides some guarantees of speech. So as long as they follow what's in the handbook, I think that's right.
Sorry, she's been sitting right in front of us trying to.
Hi, my name's Carrie Hardy. I just wanted a little bit of clarification on the gentleman's initial question. He had asked about gender pronouns and how the professor was reprimanded in regards to that. And I didn't really catch a clear answer, so I was just wondering more so about your thoughts.
Really simply, since Canada has no equivalent of the First Amendment, Canadian colleges can actually do that and probably get away with that. If you were to try to do that at a public college in the U.S. and it were to result in a lawsuit, I very strongly believe that you could not be forced to use someone's required pronouns. If it were at a private college, what you would have in that case would be very strong contractual promises of academic freedom that were propagated by the American Association of University Professors. So you'd actually have a very strong argument at virtually that you couldn't be forced to do that. Now, as fact, I think a lot of professors would just voluntarily do that. It only becomes an issue if someone's saying that you have to.
And what I would say, when we've had conversations on our campus, our attorney will say, whatever the person, however they want to be addressed, the simplest thing is just to address them however they want to be addressed. It's easy, cuts to the chase, and you don't have that kind of conflict. I know in the state of Tennessee, they were having some conversations with their board of regents talking about forcing people to use certain pronouns, and I think they shot that down. So it's going to be different. That was a statewide system. But for us, general practice is you refer to the person as they'd like to be referred, and that's what our attorney tells us. Right.
Yep. It's probably a good practice.
Hello, my name is Ben, and I go to Penn State, and that's another story. But in terms of the past, since the beginning of the election and the past couple of years, the term snowflake has been thrown around a lot. So do you think one side or the other has really started this, I guess, attack on free speech, or has it always been around? Mm-hmm. And also, has social media really played a part on really broadcasting all the, I guess, free speech infringements going around the country?
Yeah, I think that idea of snowflakes it goes in as what I talked about. More people are being critical to say college students can't handle the truth. It's not the real world. And so they have to be protected from everything else. And you get into the conversations about microaggressions. I went to University of Georgia 25 years after it was integrated by court order. So there were still, Confederate flags and stuff going on. So, forget microaggressions. I saw macro. It was just all out there. It wasn't, you just understood. You're at Georgia, and you just dealt with it, and you kept moving on. So I'm probably not the best person to handle some of those things, because I think that we have to develop, in some regards, a tougher skin, because this becomes unreal. There are things that you're going to deal with out in the general population that is not going to be, regulated the same way. So learning how to have that kind of discourse now, I think, is helpful, because, as I said earlier, most 18 to 24-year-olds are not on college campuses. So I think people are saying this is a group that has to be protected, because that's some of the language that comes out. We need to have the safe spaces. We need to have the trigger warnings. So there is a backlash to saying all these things are happening. And some people might even say that, you're the kids of my generation, the latchkey kids, that we've gone overboard. And there's been lots of studies about that. And people call your parents the helicopter parents. And when I do orientation for parents, I tell them don't be helicopter and hoverboard and all the other kind of parents because they will come in. There's studies that talk about parents coming in and, fussing at the school for not waking you up to go to class and not doing so all that's a part of the narrative, that you have parents doing all of these things. And so this is the next level. So I think that's where some of that comes from. So I think that we've got to have a balance. So it's not that when you finish, you're completely unprepared to deal with. We've always talked about college and not being the real world, but it's going to be even more of a stretch when you haven't learned how to handle some basic things, and then you really are on your own. And there are people who are getting smacked in the face because they're really struggling with making that transition.
And I personally don't like the term snowflake. I think it's not particularly productive. I also think it doesn't really describe the problem all that well. I think that currently what we're dealing with are actually something more like two highly polarized groups, both who believe the other side is essentially evil. So there's a lot of strength behind it. It's not some flimsy kind of thing. It just when you start sort of thinking about your beliefs, this is something I'm working on a book with a social psychologist, John Haidt. If you start thinking of your own ideas as sacred, then people who disagree with you are blasphemers. So I don't think they're really snowflakes at all. I think we're cultivating a very us versus them mentality on campus that I think a healthier society would do a better job of breaking. But has free speech always been in trouble? Absolutely. Free speech has always been in trouble. And what's scary for those of us who've studied the overall history of free speech for all of human civilization is moments when people really enjoy free speech very, very small, and they don't last all that long. And so I'm very aware of the fact that this is something that could be gone before we know it, and we would only start realizing it was gone when our free speech rights were finally on the line and there was nobody there to defend us.
So as a defender of...
You got to put your...
Yeah, it's... Oh, hello.
Working.
So this is specifically for Greg.
Yep.
So as a defender of the First Amendment, and I know this is going to sound horrible, but why should we listen to the Constitution? Because it's a 300-year-old document. It's kind of old. It's kind of like the Bible. So why should we listen to it? Like, why should it be taken as truth?
I think that's a very good question. I think the fact that a document has survived 300 years is actually an argument for listening to it, rather than not. We are the oldest. We have the oldest continuous constitution of any country in the world. And one of the reasons why we have it is because it was an incredibly smart balance of both positive ideals about human potential and cynicism about human failings. That essentially, one of the reasons why we have a Bill of Rights, for example, which the idea of that was George Mason. But James Madison, for example, said, the whole goal of the government is essentially to protect human freedom, to provide some basic security, but ultimately to avoid tyranny. And he wasn't convinced that there was an idea that we should have these additional Bill of Rights that actually guaranteed additional freedoms, because he was afraid not to guarantee them. He was afraid that by naming specific rights, we would actually come to believe we had only those rights and no more. And that was actually what the Founding Fathers were primarily worried about. They became convinced that they should have the 9th Amendment that left open additional freedoms, additional ideas. 10th Amendment, sort of a savings clause. I think you should listen to it because it's an incredibly clever, well thought out structure for a government. And that's one of the reasons why it has survived for so long. And I think that if you want to know about freedom of speech and the philosophy of freedom of speech, and I say this when I'm in Europe, I say this when I'm in other countries, I think the longest, best thought out way that you can have an actually genuinely diverse and pluralistic society in the real world as it actually is, I think that philosophy is the best explained in American First Amendment jurisprudence of the 20th century.
Thank you. Do you want to add to that?
Just really quickly, I would add, because you made me think, you taking my class this fall? You not taking my class? I thought you were taking my class. I teach a class on hip-hop, sex, gender, and ethical behavior, and we look at ethical principles. And so part of that is an ethical question. We have to have guide or documents or guides that as a community we operate by, because if not, you're going to have people operating from very different positions, their own ethical relativism. So you might believe one thing, I believe something completely different. How do we function in as a community when we have everybody believes their own thing? So part of that understanding of understanding ethics, and when you talk about this idea of contractarianism, this idea of the Constitution being a part of that contractarianism ethics is that it gives us as citizens in this country a framework by which to engage each other. And so that's one of the reasons we have to have that, because if you don't, you might believe in one form. I might be a Kant's moral theory person, and I believe you should do certain things just because you know it's right. And you might have much more of an Epicurean train of thought. I mean, it just could be all over the place. So I think there are some reasons that we have to have. Is it perfect? I mean, that's why we've added amendments and we keep dealing with it. But I think it gives us a framework to operate so there are at least some ground rules for all of us.
Dr. Kimbrough, Greg, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.